Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to present the results of my research at Grad Talks. The topic of my today's presentation is Language Educators' Beliefs and Practices at the intersection of language policy and plurilingual research discourses in Canada, which is a study I'm conducting as part of my doctoral program at UCL. Here is the outline of the talk. It starts with presenting the context of the research, the rationale behind it, and the research question. Then I will move on to talking about methodology, including research design, instruments, participants, data collection, and data analysis. Next, I will focus on findings with the examples from data, followed by the discussion centered around the response to the research question. Theoretical implications will follow after. I will conclude with implications for research and practice. Starting with the context, the linguistic landscape around the world, and notably in Canada, is becoming more increasingly diverse, represented by 215 international and 70 Indigenous languages, apart from English and French. Yet, Canadian language policies are mostly centered around official English in most provinces, official French in Quebec, official bilingualism in New Brunswick and Manitoba, and official multilingualism in Nunavut and Northwest Territories. As a result, there is a mismatch between the plurilingual practices in Canadian classrooms and homes and monolingual or bilingual language education policies. In response to such demographic and socio-linguistic changes, new developments in language education research, language policies, and educational practices were introduced internationally. For example, the Council of Europe introduced plurilingualism as a new approach to language education for the multilingual context in the European countries, which influenced language policies, classroom practice, and language education research in Western Europe and other countries worldwide. Changes are being made in the Global South as well. For example, in 2020, the Ministry of Education in Brazil passed a plurilingual education bill to meaningfully embrace the growing linguistic and cultural diversity in the country and include the marginalized languages of its deaf and Indigenous communities. The purpose of this study was to explore professional practices of Canadian language educators, including language teachers, language education researchers, and teacher researchers in secondary and higher education sectors. Together with researchers, teacher researchers have been involved in the development of the plurilingual approach to language education and its further implementation in their classrooms. At the same time as language teachers, they are influenced by established monolingual policy discourses. So this interplay of research and policy discourses shapes language teacher researchers' beliefs and practices. Therefore, more research is required to better understand the role and effect of the former on the latter. The rationale of this study is manifold. Most importantly, language education research views the introduction of plurilingual approaches to language education as a possible way to meet the educational needs of linguistically and culturally diverse learners. Plurilingualism and plurilingual approaches are relatively new developments in the field of language education. So the implementation of plurilingualism, and particularly its effect on language educators' beliefs and practices, are areas which require further investigation. This research project starts from the perspective that Canadian language educators' beliefs and practices are shaped or driven by the discourses in first, plurilingual research studies, and second, language policy documents. It is critical to examine whether there is consistency between their beliefs and practices, because participants' awareness of such consistency or its lack will help develop their professional agency as researchers and teachers. It will further empower them to understand the roots of their beliefs and practices, as well as interpret language policies that affect their practices, which in its turn could empower them to develop plurilingual grassroots initiatives formed by the individual language educator agency and a collaborative action research inquiry. The study focuses on the pertinence of research-informed teaching that can bridge the gap between theory and practice in language education, which can improve teacher education programs. Examining how wider language discourses affect the consistency between language educators' beliefs and practices will help contribute to the formation of a stronger professional discourse in language education. This research project is guided by the following research question. How do the dominant discourses in Canadian language policy documents and plurilingual research studies shape language educators' beliefs and practices? I used Foucauldian discourse analysis, particularly Willig's approach to Foucauldian discourse analysis, as this rigorous methodology gives opportunities for the detailed analysis of the discursive constructions and their social aspects. Another reason for this methodological choice is the relevance of Foucauldian discourse analysis for social problems requiring policy solutions. FDA is a useful analytical tool in policy analysis because it allows to produce critical assumptions about the entanglement between policy formation or reformation and social changes at large with the stakeholders involved. Its major function is to challenge policy as an instrument, questioning power relations and actors behind them, and deconstruct and call in question the social reality embedded in dominant discourses. So I used semi-structured interviews and questionnaires as my instruments. So interviews were conducted online and they consisted of 8 main questions asking about beliefs and practices. Prior to interviewing, I administered questionnaires to collect demographic information about participants. My participants were 4 language teachers, 4 researchers studying plurilingualism, and 4 teacher researchers from Canadian secondary, higher, and adult education sectors. So the analysis of this data is preliminary and based on 6 out of my 12 participants. Teaching experience of my participants ranged from 17 to 30 plus years. Their research experience fluctuated between 5 to 15 years, and their teaching research experience ranged from 2 to 10 years. They work as language instructors at private schools and universities in Canada, as well as assistant professors at universities in Canada. I used the non-probability or purposive criterion sampling of the participants, which was based on the following criteria. First of all, teacher participants teach in the secondary or higher or adult education settings. Researchers are involved in plurilingual research, and teacher researchers either collaborated with LingDA project at the moment, or they were implementing plurilingual approaches and language teaching, or they worked on improving their individual professional practice. Once participants received information letters and signed consent forms, I administered demographic questionnaires and conducted the interviews. Interviews were conducted and recorded via Zoom, transcribed and uploaded in NVivo 12 software for coding. Coding was done using a predetermined and emergent set of codes to answer the research question. A predetermined set of codes was guided by the wider discourses established in a prior study, as well as the last 4 stages of analysis according to Willig's approach to FDA. Below is an example of the coding scheme generated in NVivo during data coding and analysis. So according to this table, the last 4 stages, as adapted from Willig 2015, are presented by historical context, subject positions or stakeholders, discursive practices in plurilingual research and official language policy discourses respectively, as well as the last one, subjectivity or power knowledge aspect. Each stage is manifested by the wider discourses in plurilingual research, studies, and language policy documents respectively. For example, stage 3 or 1 in this research is presented by social justice and language education and discourse of discrimination. Stage 2 is represented by research-driven discourse and policy-driven discourse. Stage 3 is represented by plurilingual language instruction and monolingual language instruction. And the last, stage 4, is represented by pedagogical innovation discourse and assessment-driven discourse, according to my prior study. Within this predetermined coding scheme, participants were asked questions about their beliefs and practices separately, and their interview accounts were the source of data for emergent codes. For example, when talking about their beliefs about social justice and language education, as seen from this table, participants elaborated on topics ranging from access to minority language education, accessibility, agency, inclusivity, linguistic and cultural awareness, as well as parents' linguistic practices And the last, it was challenging dominant educational and policy discourses. So demonstrating how their views are shaped by the discourse in question. So here are the examples in this section. The analysis of participants' views of dominant discourses in 2 discrete domains, plurilingual research and language policy, became instrumental for understanding and being aware of the sources of power and oppression in certain discourses, which shape participants' beliefs and practices. Once again, in the analysis of participants' beliefs and practices, I adhered to the last 4 stages of Foucauldian discourse analysis, according to Willig 2015, which were also used for coding in NVivo, as outlined in the table above. First, I analyzed the discursive or historical context, stage 1, then stakeholders involved or the subject positions, stage 2, followed by the discursive practices, stage 3, which are legitimized in plurilingual research and official language policy. And finally, I looked at the participants' subjectivities through power knowledge lens, which is stage 4. Data analysis demonstrates that participants' beliefs and practices are generally either aligned with plurilingual research discourses or show mixed responses if not aligned with it, as we can see from this part of the table. So here we see aligned and mixed if not aligned. Also, participants' beliefs and practices are generally either not aligned with language policy discourses, including mixed responses, or show mixed responses if they are aligned here. Here are some excerpts from the interviews with language teachers, researchers, and teacher researchers. I will give some examples of beliefs and practices aligned with either policy discourses or research discourses, and both of them, including some mixed responses as well. Language teachers would generally give mixed responses. For example, talking about beliefs, Thea, the university-based language teacher who works with young adults, generally adopts a more utilitarian approach to language education, which should serve people's goals for them to have more possibilities. She says basically she sees inclusivity in language education as access to learning dominant languages. She says, so the more language people speak, the more possibilities they have in this world. For example, if people speak English, the whole English-speaking world is open to them, as well as other countries that try to move to having English as an international language in education. The same about German, the same about French. So it adds to all the possibilities that people have. When it comes to language policy with its discourses, both teachers agree that their practice promotes and supports dominant languages and cultures, which Thea openly admits. She says, I'm giving my students that signal, that idea, that if you speak this language, you will be able to achieve a lot of things in an English-speaking country. So by doing that, by sharing this information, by teaching the language, yes, I'm promoting dominant languages. On the contrary, researchers take a critical position about research and policy discourses based on their comments. Both researchers believe that existing official language policies, including official bilingualism, are the colonial legacy, which form a certain mentality that needs to be challenged by research. According to Adam, the mentality of one language, one nation, or one language, one culture mentality, and definitely it has to be challenged. We have no other way. I think the most committed research in language education is the kind of research that challenges these policies. You have two choices. It can either be with those policies, meaning you do research that contributes to the oppression of other languages, or you can be against those policies. There is no other alternative. You cannot be neutral in this game. The critical stance of researchers regarding language education policies in Canada is explained by their critical roles as stakeholders in the field of research. Both researchers use their professional practice in language education, both teaching and research, to challenge official language policies. For example, Anne considers that her professional practice is informed by existing language education policies as a problem. In her work, she challenges the thinking behind the bilingual policy. She says, yeah, ideally we would have a multilingual policy. We know that policies now are because of colonial legacies. So it's difficult to change the colonial legacies from one day to next. But we need to challenge the thinking behind the bilingual policy, because the bilingual policy has changed the identity of the country and the identity of the people who have lived here for a long time. Data analysis of language teachers' comments demonstrates that their levels of awareness range from little awareness about the beliefs of plurilingual language instruction to the belief that languages cannot be taught in isolation. According to Yeva, they can't be taught in isolation. I'm working with adults. Maybe it's easier to isolate children from their first language, but with adults, it's impossible. They are constantly using at least translating devices. They are constantly helping each other in their first language, and as much as possible and appropriate, we would compare certain language features of English with whatever works similarly or different in their first languages. Even though Yeva is aware of the inevitable influence of adult learners' first languages on English, she thinks that monolingual instruction is easier. Well, I'm teaching language one at a time, but it's totally fine, according to her. Of course, we all now grow up in multilingual environments and grow up plurilingual, but I'm not sure that could be easily replicated in a classroom environment. That takes a little bit of effort and a change of our perception. Yeva is aware of the benefits of plurilingualism. However, it does not translate into her practice, leading to mixed responses, both yes and no. I'm not trying to implement it, meaning plurilingual approach. I have other priorities that I have to address in my daily teaching, and most of them are focused on the English language. But I did change my understanding in recent years to seeing other languages as a resource for supporting English learning. So I'm not, for example, not as hard on my students as I used to be when they start speaking their first language in class. I give them time to use it. And the last stage, the analysis of participants' subjectivities through power knowledge lens reveals that participants are generally aware that university-led teacher education will close the gap between theory and practice and empower teachers. Like other participants, teacher researchers believe that teacher education should be informed by university research. For example, Amanda believes that teacher education lags behind the university research by a couple of decades. I had to have a first meeting instructing everybody about plurilingualism, she says, and it's been around for 20 years. It's not like it's new. So there is a gap there. And I understand if they were unfamiliar with the CFR. I understand because it's more for Europe, but even the vocabulary, I was surprised that they still talk about the 4 skills and we don't talk about mediation. We don't talk about competences, according to Amanda. Most participants are aware of assessment as an instrument of accountability imposed through language policy. They don't teach for assessment because, according to Amanda, it wasn't about the evaluation at all. I want them to learn about my culture and my language. Nora's biggest concern is that students learn for assessment. and they care more about assessments than I do. In the context of accountability, she says, assessment, you can't get away from it. It's one of the requirements of the job and one of the ways that I have to be accountable to the school administration and to the parents and the students. So to answer the research question, I synthesized participants' responses from the 4 stages of the analysis, and further data interpretation suggests that participants' beliefs are generally aligned with their practices with various levels of consistency. The most consistent data is represented by the responses of the 2 researchers and 1 teacher researcher. Another teacher researcher and one of the language teachers' beliefs are generally consistent with their practices, but with mixed responses. The most inconsistent data was received from another language teacher whose beliefs don't match her practices, including mixed responses. So as we can see, there are 2 groups of participants here. Group 1, participants' beliefs and practices are consistent when aligned with plurilingual research discourses, including Adam and Anne as researchers and Amanda as a teacher researcher. And group 2, participants' beliefs and practices are inconsistent when aligned with both plurilingual research and policy discourses, including Nora, teacher researcher, Thea, and Yeva, language teachers. Let's look at the first group now. As evident from the profiles of 2 researchers and 1 teacher researcher interviewed for the study, their beliefs and practices show consistency due to the alignment with plurilingual research discourses. There are multiple reasons behind that. First of all, researcher and teacher researcher participants have high levels of awareness of their beliefs and practices, and they actively create affordances for plurilingual instruction for other language educators and language learners for better language awareness in line with previous research. In context of Canada, the promotion of linguistic and cultural awareness is key for educators to understand the needs of their culturally and linguistically diverse learners. Another significant point is that participants' high levels of awareness of their beliefs and practices contribute to their well-developed professional agency. As previously mentioned, the role that professional agency plays with educational discourses could be instrumental for social change, with them empowered individuals changing the power of existing discourses. So illustrative in this study with researcher and teacher researcher participants empowered by the discourse of plurilingual research to question dominant monolingualism evident through language policy discourses. The question of whether it is important to challenge dominant discourses was addressed by 1 researcher as all the time. That's what I do for a living. Researchers develop plurilingual instruction strategies not only to challenge the dominant monolingual instruction for linguistic and cultural awareness, but are also involved in co-creating professional counter discourses of plurilingualism as an alternative to traditional monolingualism. This is usually a collaborative and iterative process which starts as a university research project and develops into a large-scale initiative involving bottom-up cooperation with teachers, researchers, and action researchers on a local and international level, with the goal to raise awareness of plurilingualism in language education and support teachers in implementing plurilingual approaches in their practice. What is more, researchers' professional practice impacts teachers' professional development and teacher education programs of their universities, which contributes to bridging the gap between theory and practice in language education. All 3 participants are engaged in professional development of other teachers, developing pedagogical materials, making them available, free and accessible. For example, researchers deeply engage with the issues of social justice and language education by focusing on their students' identities and impact they could make in society. They try to empower TESOL students to contribute to social justice in education as well. Let's move on to the second group now. The profiles of 2 teachers and another teacher researcher interviewed for the study reveal inconsistency between their beliefs and practices due to their alignment with language policy and plurilingual research discourses at the same time. First of all, some of the teachers and teacher researchers' responses suggest that they are not fully aware of the contradictory nature of their beliefs and practices. Even though a teacher researcher is involved in creating affordances for plurilingual instruction in her classroom, this participant is focused on her classroom only. Teacher participants would only acknowledge the need for language awareness in general, finding other teaching goals to be more important. According to Thea, we try to teach students the major tricks how to be successful in the academic world in an English-speaking country. Such responses point to the prevalence or the impact of the dominant monolingual discourses and monolingual mindsets, framing instructors' own pedagogical responses to the linguistic diversity in their classes. Thus, participants' beliefs and practices construct their professional agency differently from the first group. None of them is concerned about challenging official language policies and dominant discourses. Rather, they are restricted by the demands of their own curriculum. Such inconsistency in their participants' beliefs and practices neither empowers them as professionals nor advances them as agents of change. Monolingual instruction is a dominant practice for teacher participants. These 3 participants practice plurilingual instruction with various levels of commitment or awareness, from sporadic references to their students' first languages, to actively encouraging students to make connections with other languages in their repertoire or in their learning environment. However, none of them is an active co-creator of the discourses counteractive to monolingual dominance, with a teacher researcher being a co-contributor to the process as part of the research project. In terms of how their professional practice affects teacher education, language teachers note that they are either not involved in teacher preparation or they are constrained by the program hours. Therefore, they are not aware of any impact. The teacher researcher believes that her connection with the research project, her publications and presentations are impactful for teacher education programs because of the ties with the university, all this making her a contributor to promoting language awareness and plurilingualism. Overall, data interpretation suggests that the alignment with plurilingual research discourses results in participants' beliefs consistent with practices, while the alignment with both plurilingual research and language policy discourses leads to participants' beliefs being inconsistent and mismatching their practices. Therefore, such results lead to the main conclusion that for beliefs and practices of language educators to be consistent and not affected by the monolingual mindset or dominant educational policies, professional practice of language educators should be informed by research only. This research has some theoretical and practical implications. From the theoretical perspective, the Foucauldian approach to data analysis opens up more opportunities for applying a critical lens to the analysis of language educators' beliefs and practices shaped by various discourses at the intersection of which they work. The focus on the context raises the question of the importance of promoting awareness in all its forms, awareness of linguistic and cultural diversity of their students, awareness of their own beliefs and practices, awareness of existing power relations and the roles they, as language educators, play within the discourses. High levels of awareness become formative for the development of their professional agency within their discourses or their subject positions and inform their everyday practice. Awareness of the power of the choices they make as teachers or researchers engaged with particular language policies has far-reaching consequences for language educators' practices. Understanding the roots of language educators' beliefs and practices helps to explain the consistency or inconsistency regarding language teachers' beliefs about plurilingualism and their actual practices, similarly to other studies. So such understanding will lead to improved and strengthened practices. Finally, the power knowledge lens reveals how language educators exercise their professional agency, either abiding by traditional teaching or assessment practices or trying to make an impact in their discourse by promoting innovative approaches to language education or changing the purpose of teacher education programs. This research further supports calls for plurilingualism, replacing monolingualism in language education. This research project has several implications for educational research as well. The most important outcome of this study is the idea that teaching should be research-informed for language educators' beliefs and practices to be consistent. Prior research pointed to the inconsistency of language teachers' beliefs and practices regarding multi- or plurilingualism, mostly caused by the monolingual mindsets and institutional monolingual policy discourses. This study showed that researchers and teacher researchers' beliefs and practices are consistent due to their alignment with the research discourses. Finally, professional practice of language educators would benefit from more focus on the awareness of their professional contexts, how they exercise their professional agency through their practices, and impact they produce in the field of language education. For example, language teachers would mostly benefit from promoting linguistic and cultural awareness in their classrooms, doing action research, or collaborating on action research projects. Teacher researchers should liaise between teachers and researchers to conduct workshops or seminars for professional development purposes. Researchers would benefit from redesigning teacher education programs towards a more innovative and university research-informed agenda. So here is the list of the references used for this presentation. And thank you very much for your attention today.